They told the widow she had until sundown. What none of them noticed was the small mound of fresh-turned earth beside the old horse trough, or the promise she whispered into it before she walked away. If you've ever had to leave something behind that you weren't ready to let go of, you already know how this story feels before it even begins. Stay with Tabitha Vance to the end. You'll want to see what the ground gave back to her. And if a story about quiet courage means something to you, a like helps more people find it. Now, Bitter Creek Basin, late autumn, the year the railroad men came for the valley. The wind came down off the ridge the way it always did in October, carrying the smell of frost before the frost itself arrived, rattling the dry aspen leaves against the fence rails Franklin Vance had set with his own hands 11 years before. Tabitha stood at the gate of the only home she had ever built, watching three men in city coats unroll a paper across the hood of a buggy as though it were a flag they had already planted. She was 52 years old, and she had buried a husband, 2 winters of drought, and more pride than most people carried in a lifetime. She did not cry. The men who came to watch, because word traveled fast in Bitter Creek Basin, and shame was the valley's favorite entertainment, noticed that first. No tears, no pleading, just a woman in a gray wool coat, standing very straight, her hands folded in front of her the way she used to fold them in church. The man holding the paper was named Elias Crane, and he had the kind of smile that made people check their pockets after shaking his hand. He read from the document without looking up, the way a man reads something he has read aloud too many times to feel the weight of it anymore. Note of pledge, executed by Franklin Vance, dated the 3rd of March, he said. Property reverts to the holder upon default. The holder is the Landers Point Commercial Syndicate. Effective immediately. My husband never signed a pledge on this land, Tabitha said. Her voice did not rise. It rarely did anymore. Crane turned the paper so she could see the signature at the bottom, the familiar slant of Franklin's hand, the loop on the V that she had watched him practice as a young man, courting her on her father's porch. She looked at it for a long moment. That's his hand, she admitted. Then we understand each other. We understand, she said, that you have his hand, not necessarily his hour. Crane's smile flickered, just slightly, the way a lamp flickers when someone opens a door somewhere in the house. He rolled the paper closed. You have until sundown to remove what's yours, Mrs. Vance. The wagon by the barn, I'm told, still runs. Behind him, 2 hired men were already walking the fence line with the loose, proprietary gait of men counting something that did not yet belong to them. Tabitha did not answer. She turned instead toward the old horse corral at the eastern edge of the yard, where a gray dappled stallion stood with his ears pinned flat, watching the strangers the way a man watches a snake he has not yet decided is dangerous. The townsfolk called him difficult. Franklin had called him Providence, because he'd come to the ranch half-starved during the worst winter of their marriage and lived anyway. She walked to the fence line near the old curl, knelt in the cold dirt in her good coat without seeming to notice the cold at all, and drove a short stake of acacia wood into the ground beside a marker only she would have recognized. Nobody close enough heard what she said. A few said later they saw her lips move. One boy, young enough not to know better than to ask questions of grown men, tugged his father's sleeve and asked what the widow was doing. Losing, his father said, and pulled him along. She rose, brushed the dirt from her knees, and walked to the wagon without looking back at the house. Montgomery Sterling watched all of it from the far side of the road, seated on his gray mare with the stillness of a man who had spent 20 years deciding other people's fates from behind a bench and had not entirely lost the habit of watching before speaking. He was known in the valley as a horseman now, though older folks still called him judge out of habit, and younger folks called him nothing at all because he rarely gave them reason to address him. He did not go to her. He was not certain, yet, what kind of help a woman like that would accept, and he had learned the hard way that offering the wrong kind of mercy could do as much damage as offering none. But he watched the way she knelt by the fence, the way she rose without looking for a hand to help her up, the way she did not turn to see whether the town was watching her leave. He had presided over enough ruined men to know the difference between someone broken and someone waiting. She did not look broken. He turned his mare toward home before anyone could catch him staring. The old relay station 3 miles east of town had not sheltered a traveler in over a decade. Its roof sagged in the northeast corner where a beam had rotted through, and mice had long since claimed the floorboards as their own territory. but it had 4 walls and half a chimney that still drew smoke if the wind came from the right direction. Tabitha unloaded the wagon there as the light went the color of a bruise over the ridgeline, and she did not weep even then, though she allowed herself, once the horses were tied and the fire caught, to sit very still for a long while with her hands pressed flat against her knees. She had a trunk of clothes, a crate of kitchen goods, 3 sacks of feed, a rifle she knew how to use better than most men in the valley, and a small metal box she had not opened in 11 years, wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of the wagon bed, where Crane's men had not thought to look, because men who are stealing land rarely think to search for something smaller than a deed. She did not open it that night either. In town, word of the eviction spread the way water finds every crack in old wood. By morning, the general store had already turned it into gossip seasoned with judgment. Some said she should have fought harder. Some said she should have remarried years ago, taken some rancher's name and his protection along with it. Nobody asked why a woman who had run that spread alone since her husband's death, who had weathered 2 droughts and a hard winter that killed half the herds in the basin, would suddenly lose it all to a piece of paper nobody in town had ever seen before that week. Nobody asked because it was easier not to. Tabitha knew this. She had known it for 11 years, ever since the night Franklin came home with fever already climbing in him and made her promise, made her swear on her mother's Bible, that she would never tell a soul what he'd done that autumn, not until the valley itself was ready to hear it. She had kept that promise through his death, through the whispers that followed her afterward, through the slow erosion of a reputation she had once been proud of. She had let the town believe whatever it wanted to believe about a woman who kept too many secrets and asked for too little help. She had told herself, for 11 years, that silence was a kind of loyalty. Sitting in the cold relay station with the fire guttering low, she was no longer certain that was true. The auction notice went up outside the land office on a Tuesday, nailed to the post beneath a notice for a barn dance and a reward for a stolen mule, as though the sale of an entire valley's worth of family land belonged in the same column as lost livestock. Public sale of parcels, it read. Landers Point Railway Extension. Interested parties apply within. The parcels, as it turned out, included more than the Vance Ranch. Old Wickham's spread to the north, the Delgado family's grazing land along the creek, half the small holdings that had fed the valley since before the war. All of them, it emerged over the following weeks, carried the same peculiar defect, a pledge note, freshly discovered, signed by men who had died months before the date written on the paper. Tabitha learned this from Delgado's widowed sister, who came to the relay station with a basket of bread and a face gray with the same fury Tabitha had been carrying alone. They took Miguel's land the same way, the woman said. Same syndicate, same kind of paper. I thought it was only us. It's not only us, Tabitha said, and something in her settled, cold and clear, into place. Not comfort exactly. Recognition. The particular relief of learning that a wound you believed was yours alone was in fact a wound shared by half the valley. She began, after that, to listen more carefully to the men at the feed store who complained about the syndicate's prices without understanding why the prices had changed, to the women at church who spoke of families leaving the basin the way people speak of weather, as though it were simply happening to everyone and nobody in particular. She kept a small ledger book, the kind Franklin used to use for cattle counts, and began writing down names, families, dates, the peculiar coincidence of every forged pledge arriving in the months just after a man's death, when a grieving widow was least likely to examine a signature too closely. It was Providence who gave her the second thread to pull. The stallion had refused, since the day of the eviction, to leave the eastern pasture of what was no longer her land. The syndicate's men had tried 3 times to move him, first with rope, then with a hired horsebreaker from Landers Point, then with the crude persuasion of a whip that left a mark along his flank that made Tabitha's jaw tighten when she heard of it secondhand. Each time, the horse had planted himself at the same patch of ground near the old watering trough and refused, with a violence that surprised even the men who thought they knew him, to be moved. Devil horse, the hired breaker told anyone who'd listen, nursing a bruised shoulder at the saloon. Won't let a man within 10 feet of that trough, like he's standing guard over something. Tabitha heard this from the same widow who'd brought her the bread, relayed secondhand and dismissed as the complaint of an embarrassed man protecting his pride. But she had known that horse for 11 years. She had watched Franklin work with him through 2 winters when no one else in the valley would go near him. And she remembered, with a clarity that made her hands go still over her ledger, that the old trough sat no more than 6 feet from the acacia stake she'd driven into the ground the day they took the ranch. She did not go back that week. She was not ready. And going back too soon, she understood with the same instinct that had kept her silent for 11 years, would only confirm to Crane's men that there was something worth finding. Instead, she waited and watched and wrote names in her ledger and did not open the small metal box wrapped in oilcloth, though she thought about it every night before she slept. Montgomery Sterling found reason to ride past the relay station more often than the season strictly required. He told himself it was concern for a neighbor, though he had never once, in 11 years, thought of the Vance ranch as neighboring anything of his. He brought grain he claimed was surplus. He brought news from town phrased as idle talk, though he chose carefully what he shared and what he withheld. He did not tell her, that autumn, about the railway survey he himself had signed off on 9 years earlier, granting right-of-way through the Eastern Basin in exchange for a settlement that had, at the time, seemed a fair and unremarkable transaction between a retiring judge and a company promising prosperity for a struggling valley. He had not thought of that survey in years. He had certainly not connected it, not yet, to the syndicate now stripping the same valley of its family lands one forged signature at a time. He noticed, instead, the way Tabitha received his visits, polite, contained, grateful in a manner that cost her something to display, as though gratitude itself were a debt she resented incurring. He noticed that she never asked him for anything beyond what he offered, and that she watched him, in return, with the careful attention of someone deciding whether he was a danger or merely a witness. "You could leave," he told her once, standing by his mare while she stacked firewood against the relay station's crumbling south wall. "Take what they're offering. There'll be a settlement figure, eventually. There always is, with these syndicates. Enough to start again somewhere the winters are kinder." "You think I should leave?" she said. It was not quite a question. "I think," he said carefully, "that nobody would blame you for choosing peace over a fight you didn't ask for." She set down the log in her hands and looked at him with an expression he found difficult to read. Not anger, not quite, but something adjacent to it, worn smooth by long acquaintance. "Judge," she said. She still called him that, though he had told her twice she needn't. "I did not ask for the fight 11 years ago either. It found me regardless." She did not explain what she meant, and he did not ask, though the words stayed with him longer than he expected, turning over in his mind on the ride home like a stone he could not quite identify by feel alone. The offer came in November, delivered by a clerk in a coat too fine for the weather, who handed her an envelope with the particular delicacy of a man accustomed to delivering both charity and bribery and knowing the two often looked identical from a distance. For $1,000. A full and final renunciation of any claim, past or future, to the Vance property or any adjoining parcel. A stipulation, in smaller print near the bottom, that she would make no public statement regarding the circumstances of the pledged note or its execution. It was more money than Tabitha had held in her hands at any point in her life. It was, she understood immediately, an admission. No syndicate paid that generously for land it believed it already legally owned. She sat with the offer for 3 days. She thought about a house somewhere warmer, somewhere no one knew her name or the particular shape of her grief. She thought about the ledger book full of names, families who could not afford lawyers, families who had already left the valley believing there was no fight left to have. She thought about Franklin, feverish and pleading, extracting a promise from her that she had kept far longer than she suspected he'd intended, a promise that had cost her a reputation she had once been proud of and had not. She now understood with a clarity that felt almost violent in its suddenness, actually protected anyone at all. It had protected his memory. It had not protected the valley. She thought about kneeling by the acacia stake with dirt on her good coat, and about a gray stallion who would not let a hired man within 10 feet of an old stone trough. On the 4th day, she rode into Landers Point, found the clerk who delivered the offer, and told him she would give her answer at the public auction, in front of the same crowd that had watched her carry her belongings out in a plain wagon. The clerk seemed confused by this. Refusals, in his experience, were typically delivered quietly, by letter, not staged as declarations. "Tell Mr. Crane," Tabitha said, "that I'll be there." She did not tell Montgomery Sterling what she intended. She told him only that she needed him to be at the auction, and that she needed, if he was willing, the use of a shovel and a second pair of hands he could trust to keep silent until she gave him leave to speak. He did not ask her what they were digging for. He had spent enough years reading the careful evasions of witnesses on a stand to recognize when a question would cost more trust than it earned, and he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not want to spend that trust carelessly. He simply told her he would come, and that he would bring the shovel, and that whatever it was, he suspected it mattered a great deal more than $4,000. The night before the auction, Crane's foreman ordered the old stable and watering trough demolished, a precaution, he told his men, against squatters or thieves hiding among the ruins before the parcels changed hands. It was meant to be done quietly, before dawn, while the town slept and the widow, presumably, wept somewhere out of sight. Providence would not allow it. The stallion fought the ropes with a violence the hired men had not seen from him even in October, driving two of them back against the fence rail hard enough to crack a board, planting himself squarely across the trough itself as though he understood, in whatever way an animal understands anything, that the ground beneath his hooves mattered more than his own comfort. One man was thrown clear and broke his wrist against the frozen dirt. The others, cursing, backed off before dawn to wait for daylight and reinforcements, unwilling to risk further injury over a demolition that could as easily wait until noon. It was enough time. Barely. The auction ground had been set up in the wide dirt yard before the old Vance ranch house. Tables draped in cloth too fine for a cattle valley, a raised platform for the auctioneer, and a crowd larger than Tabitha had expected, drawn as much by the spectacle of watching a disgraced widow's home change hands as by any genuine interest in bidding. Elias Crane stood near the platform in a coat the color of good coffee, shaking hands, accepting congratulations before the sale had even begun, the particular confidence of a man who has already counted his winnings twice. Tabitha arrived as the auctioneer was reading the terms of the first parcel, driving the same plain wagon she had carried her belongings away in 2 months before, with Montgomery Sterling riding beside her and a small iron-bound box, streaked with mud and 11 years of buried silence, resting between her feet. The crowd went quiet the way crowds do when they sense something has shifted beneath the surface of an ordinary afternoon. She did not wait for permission to speak. She climbed down from the wagon, lifted the box herself before Sterling could reach it, and walked to the platform with the same unhurried steadiness the town had noted the day they took her land. No tears, no pleading. Only the particular calm of a woman who has finally run out of reasons to stay silent. "Mr. Crane has a signature," she said, loud enough to carry across the yard, "that he claims proves my husband pledged this land as collateral. I'd like the circuit officer, if he's present, to examine what I found buried beneath the trough your men tried to destroy last night." Crane's smile did not falter, not immediately, though something behind his eyes went very still. "Mrs. Vance, this is neither the time nor—" "It is precisely the time," said a voice from the edge of the crowd, and the circuit judge, a lean, unhurried man named Callahan, present that day only to formalize the sale, stepped forward with the particular curiosity of a man who had spent 30 years learning to recognize the smell of fraud before it was proven. "I'd like to see what's in the box, Mrs. Vance." She opened it there, in front of the whole gathered town, her hands steady though her heart was not. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas that had kept 11 years of damp from touching the paper within, lay the original land grants issued to the valley's founding families, Vance, Delgado, Whitcomb, and a dozen others, along with the founding charter of a cooperative Franklin Vance had helped establish in secret the autumn before his death, a legal instrument designating the Eastern Basin as commonly held land, immune to individual pledge or sale without the unanimous consent of every founding family named within it. The pledge notes Crane's syndicate had been using to seize the valley's farms were worthless. They always had been. A man cannot mortgage what he does not solely own. He knew, Tabitha said, into a silence so complete she could hear the wind moving through the pines on the ridge. "My husband knew the syndicate was already circling this valley before he died. He couldn't stop the railway men from buying up land legally, so he made sure there was nothing left for them to steal. He made me promise not to speak of it until the valley itself needed proof. I kept that promise for 11 years, and I let this town believe I was weak and complicit and ashamed because I thought silence was the price of protecting his memory. She looked, briefly, at Crane, whose coffee-colored coat suddenly seemed a size too large for the man wearing it. I was wrong about one thing, she said. It was never his memory that needed protecting. It was this. She lifted the charter, its ink faded but legible, and handed it to Judge Callahan. What followed was not fast, and it was not entirely satisfying in the way the town might have wished, because real justice rarely resolves itself in a single afternoon the way a good story wants it to. Callahan halted the auction on the spot, pending a formal review of the founding charter's validity. Crane protested, loudly at first, then with increasing quiet as more of the valley's dispossessed families, Delgados, Whitcombs, a dozen others, began arriving from the edges of the crowd, drawn by word that had already begun to spread the way word always did in Bitter Creek Basin, only this time carrying truth instead of gossip. It was in the confusion of that gathering crowd that Montgomery Sterling stepped forward and said, in a voice that cost him more than anyone watching understood, that he had signed the original right-of-way survey 9 years before, believing at the time it was a fair transaction, and that he bore some responsibility for the syndicate's foothold in the valley, whatever came of the charter's review. Nobody had asked him to say it. Tabitha had certainly not asked him to. He said it anyway, watching her face as he did, as though her opinion of the confession mattered more to him than the town's. She did not forgive him for it there, in front of everyone. She only nodded, once, in the manner of someone filing away a fact to be reckoned with later, in private, when there was time to decide what forgiveness might actually require. Providence stood at the edge of the yard through all of it, held by no one, tied to nothing, watching the crowd with the same wary stillness he had held since the day the wagon carried Tabitha away. When the charter changed hands from Tabitha to Callahan, when the crowd's murmur shifted from suspicion to something closer to shame at how easily they had believed the worst of a grieving woman, the stallion crossed the yard on his own, unbidden, and came to stand beside her, not skittish, not straining against any rope, simply present, his head lowering slightly as she reached up without looking and rested her hand against his neck. It was, several people said afterward, the first time in 3 years anyone had seen that horse allow a human hand near him without a fight. Nobody could explain it, exactly. Tabitha did not try to. She only stood there, her hand against the warm gray of his neck, while a corrupt land syndicate's fortunes unraveled in the dirt yard of the home they had taken from her, and let herself, for the first time in 11 years, feel something that was not quite grief and not quite triumph, but some third thing, harder to name, that sat in her chest like the first breath after a long time underwater. The formal review took the better part of the winter. Elias Crane and 2 of his associates were charged with document fraud once handwriting examiners confirmed what Tabitha had already suspected, that the signatures on every pledge note bore the marks of forgery, traced from genuine documents filed years earlier at the county recorder's office. The syndicate's assets, such as they were, went first to cover the fraud's damages, and what remained was divided, under Judge Callahan's order, among the families whose lands had been wrongfully seized. It did not restore everything. Old Whitcomb had already died that January, his heart giving out before he learned his family's name had been cleared, and his children inherited a vindication their father never lived to see. The Delgado sister who'd brought Tabitha bread in October wept, when the news finally came, not with joy exactly, but with the particular exhaustion of grief finally permitted to rest. The railway itself was not stopped entirely. The valley could not, in the end, refuse all progress, and a scaled survey eventually ran a spur line along the basin's northern edge, while clear of the founding family's land, negotiated this time in daylight, with lawyers the cooperative could finally afford. Tabitha did not sell the ranch to anyone, though she was offered, more than once that spring, prices that would have made a wealthy woman of her twice over. She converted the old house instead into the seat of the valley's new landholders cooperative, the same cooperative Franklin had founded in secret 11 years before, now operating openly, with Tabitha as its first elected chair, a position no one in the valley thought to contest. She restored her husband's name to the wooden marker at the valley's entrance, weathered and half illegible until she had it recut that spring, Vance, and beneath it, smaller, the words he'd asked her to add the year they married, and she had never quite gotten around to, for those who stay. Montgomery Sterling did not become a fixture at the ranch overnight. Their reconciliation, if it could be called that, was slower and more careful than the town's gossip made it sound. Built across a winter of small visits, honest conversations about what his silence and his old survey had cost people he had never bothered to picture as individuals, and a patience on both their parts that neither had expected to find so late in life. He did not ask her forgiveness a second time. He simply kept showing up, doing the work the cooperative needed, and let her decide in her own time what to make of him. She had not fully decided, even by spring, but she no longer minded the sound of his mare's hooves on the road. By the time the first green came up through the last of the snow, the ranch looked less like a battlefield and more like what it had always been meant to be. A working place, full of noise and purpose, its fences mended, its barn rebuilt with lumber the cooperative's members had donated in a single long Saturday of shared labor that felt, to everyone who took part in it, more like a homecoming than a chore. Tabitha stood on the porch one April morning with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, watching three children from town take turns being led around the yard on Providence's back, the stallion patient now, in a way no one who'd known him 3 years earlier would have believed possible. He had let no man near him for the better part of a decade after his first owner's death, until a widow with nothing left to lose had knelt beside a trough and asked the ground, and perhaps the horse standing near it, to keep something safe a little longer. Montgomery Sterling rode up the lane as he often did now, dismounting without ceremony, standing beside her at the porch rail with the easy quiet of two people who had stopped needing every silence filled. "They're getting good," he said, nodding toward the children. "He's a patient teacher," Tabitha said, more than he ever let on. They stood together for a while, watching the valley wake up around them. Green pasture where there had been only frost, laughter where there had been only auction talk, a name recut into a wooden marker that no longer needed defending. "I used to think," Tabitha said, not quite to him, not quite to herself, that keeping quiet was the only way to protect what mattered. That if I just held on tight enough and stayed silent long enough, nothing more could be taken from me. And now, she watched the children, watched the horse, watched the mountains going gold at the edges as the sun cleared the ridge. "Now I think the silence never protected anything," she said. "It only delayed the day I'd have to be brave." Montgomery didn't answer right away. He simply stood beside her, watching the same valley, in no hurry at all to be anywhere else. This is a story about a woman the town was certain had lost everything, and about the quiet, stubborn work of proving them wrong, not with wealth, not with vengeance, but with the truth she had carried alone for 11 years and the courage, finally, to set it down where everyone could see it. If Tabitha's story stayed with you, tell us in the comments which moment moved you most: the stake in the ground, the horse who wouldn't move, or the box that finally opened. Subscribe if you want more stories like hers, and we'll see you in the next one.